On the night of June 5-6, having reorganized his cabinet, Paul Reynaud inducted me into the government as Deputy Minister of National Defence. This news was told to me in the morning by General de Lestrade, Inspector of Armoured Forces, who had heard about it on the radio. Soon came a telegram with official confirmation. Bidding farewell to the division, I headed for Paris. Appearing on the Rue Saint-Dominique, I found there the Prime Minister. He was, as always, confident, agile, sarcastic, listened attentively to the interlocutor, quickly decided. He explained to me why a few days earlier he had found it necessary to introduce Marshal Pétain into his cabinet, who, we were both sure of it, served as a screen for the supporters of the armistice. Better to have him inside than outside, observed Paul Reynaud, repeating a well-known expression. I am afraid, however, you may have to change your point of view, I replied, especially as events will now develop rapidly, and a wave of defeatism threatens to overwhelm everything. The Germans are so far superior to us in strength that, unless a miracle occurs, we have not the slightest hope of winning the metropolis, or even of holding on to it. Besides, the command, paralyzed by the suddenness of events, is no longer capable of anything. Finally, you know better than anyone to what extent the mood of defeatism is strong in government circles. This creates favourable conditions for Pétain and those behind him. However, if we lost the war of 1940, we can win another war. Without stopping the struggle in Europe while it is possible, it is necessary at the same time to decide to continue the war in our overseas possessions and prepare for it. Such a decision also requires an appropriate policy. The transfer of the necessary funds to North Africa, the selection of command personnel capable of leading operations, the preservation of close ties with the British, without regard to past offences. I am ready to engage in the development of the necessary measures. Paul Reynaud agreed with me. I ask you, he said, to go to London as soon as possible. During the negotiations with the English government, which I conducted on May 26 and May 31, in London it may have seemed that we do not exclude the possibility of an armistice. However, it is now necessary to convince the English that we will continue the struggle at all costs, and if necessary, even outside the metropolis. When you meet Churchill, tell him that the reorganization of my cabinet and your participation in it shows our determination. In addition to this general task, I had to secure agreement in London that the British Air Force, mainly fighter aviation, should continue to participate in military operations in France. Finally, I had to insist, as the Prime Minister had done before, on accurate information as to how long it would take to rearm and retransport to the continent the British troops who had escaped defeat at Dunkirk. To answer these two questions required certain technical data that could be provided by the relevant headquarters, but also needed the decision of Winston Churchill as Secretary of Defence. While preparations were being made for the negotiations which I was to conduct in the English capital, I met General Weyand at Montreat Castle on June 8. The Commander-in-Chief was calm and kept his composure. But a few minutes of conversation were enough to realize that he had reconciled himself to the idea of defeat and had decided on an armistice. Here is almost verbatim the content of our conversation, which, and this is quite understandable, this is deeply imprinted in my memory. As you see, said to me the Commander-in-Chief, I was not mistaken when a few days ago I told you that the Germans will begin an offensive on the Somme on June 6. They are indeed advancing. At present they are crossing the Somme. I am unable to prevent them. Well, let them cross. And next? The Seine and the Marne are next. Right. And then? But that's the end. The end. And the whole world. And our empire. General Weygand laughed sorrowfully. Empire? You can't be serious. As for the rest of the world, not a week after I am defeated here, and England has already begun negotiations with Germany. And, looking me straight in the eye, the Commander-in-Chief added, if only I was sure that the Germans will leave me enough forces to maintain order. To argue with Weygand was useless. Before leaving, I told the Commander-in-Chief that his views do not correspond to the intentions of the government. It was determined not to stop fighting, even if it had no hope of success. The general made no reply to this, and bade me a very kind farewell. Before leaving for Paris, I had conversations with several officers of my acquaintance on the various staffs who had appeared that morning to report to General Weygand. These conversations further convinced me that in our commanding spheres the war is considered lost. and that while continuing mechanically in the performance of his duties, everyone thinks to himself, and will soon speak openly, of the necessity of putting an end to the battle for France by any means. In order to direct the aspiration of the people and their energies to the continuation of the war in the French Empire, the government will have to take decisive measures. This I reported on my return to Paul Reynaud, and insisted that General Weygand, who had reconciled himself to the thought of defeat, should be removed from command. It cannot be done now, replied the President of the Council of Ministers. But we must think of a replacement. What is your opinion? Yes, as for a replacement, I said, at the moment I see no one but Huntsiger. Although he does not have everything necessary for this role, but I think he can rise to the need to think in terms of scale and world strategy. Paul Reynaud agreed in principle with my recommendation. However, he was reluctant to take immediate action. I decided in the near future to raise again the question of the continuation of the struggle, took up the development of a plan to transfer to North Africa all that could be transferred there. The headquarters of the army, together with the headquarters of the Navy and Air Force, had already begun preparations for the evacuation across the Mediterranean Sea and North Africa, all the forces and means that did not take part in the fighting. In particular, it was necessary to withdraw 2 contingents of recruits trained at training sites in the western and southern parts of the country, and that part of the personnel of the mechanized forces which survived after the defeat in the north. In total, this amounted to 500,000 trained soldiers. In the future, it would certainly be possible to evacuate by sea the remnants of our defeated armies, a large number of combat units retreating to the sea coast. The remnants of the bomber aviation, the range of which made it possible to overcome the sea by air, the surviving squadrons of fighters, the personnel of air bases, the Navy and, finally, our fleet. All this in any case could be transferred to Africa. A total tonnage of transport ships, which our fleet lacked to carry out these transports, was estimated at 500,000 tons. The missing ships, in addition to what the French fleet had, could be asked from England. On June 9, early in the morning, an airplane took me to London. With me arrived my adjutant Geoffroy de Courcelles, head of the diplomatic office of the Prime Minister, Roland de Margerie. It was Sunday. The English capital breathed peace, almost serenity. Streets and parks filled with peacefully strolling public, lines of people at the entrances to the movies, streams of automobiles, respectable doormen at the doors of hotels and clubs. All this belonged to a world that was not engulfed by war. Of course, the newspapers occasionally slipped in information about the true state of affairs, in spite of the embellished reports and naive anecdotes with which the optimists of duty here, as in Paris, filled the newspaper columns. Certainly, the advertisements that the population read, the shelters they built, and the gas masks they carried with them were reminders of the impending danger. But it was evident that the vast majority of the population had not yet realized the seriousness of the events taking place in France. So rapid was their pace. In any case, it was clear that, in the opinion of the British, the English Channel is still wide enough. Churchill received me in Downing Street. It was my first meeting with him. The impression of it strengthened my conviction that Great Britain, led by a fighter like him, will never submit. Churchill seemed to me a man who could do the most difficult task, as long as it was grandiose. Confidence of his judgment, broad erudition, knowledge of most of the problems, countries, people in question, and finally a great interest in military matters were fully manifested during the conversation. Among other things, by his character Churchill was created to act, to take risks, to influence the course of events and decisively and without shyness. In short, I found that he is quite consistent with the role of leader and commander. These were my first impressions. Later they were confirmed. In addition, I was convinced that Churchill is gifted with a great eloquence and great skill to use it. Whether he was addressing a crowd, Parliament, the Council of Ministers, or an individual interlocutor, whether he was speaking before a microphone, from a rostrum, at the dinner table or at the writing table, the inspired flow of his sublime and original thoughts, arguments, and sentiments always gave him almost unquestionable authority in the tragic environment in which the unhappy world was suffocating. A tried politician, he used this divine and demonic gift both to move inert Englishmen and to the humour with which he was able to colour his words and actions, his ability to display either magnanimity or anger. In everything it was felt to what extent this man was able to subdue the terrible game in which he was involved. The sharp and unpleasant clashes, which repeatedly occurred between us on account of the difference in our characters, on account of certain contradictions between the interests of our countries, and in consequence of the injustices which England allowed to the detriment of bleeding France, influenced my attitude towards the Prime Minister, but by no means changed my opinion of him. Throughout the tragedy, Winston Churchill appeared to me as a great champion of a great cause and a great figure of a great history. On that day, I told the English Prime Minister what I had been instructed by the President of the French Council of Ministers, to tell him concerning the readiness of the French government to continue the struggle, even if it had to be continued in our overseas possessions. Churchill expressed great satisfaction at this decision. Would it, however, lead to any practical results? He made it clear to me that he was not sure of that. In any case, he no longer believed in the possibility of restoring martial law in France itself, which was evident from his categorical refusal to throw us to the aid of the main forces of British military aviation. After the evacuation of British troops from Dunkirk, British aviation took only sporadic participation in the battle, with the exception of a detachment of fighter planes, which fought alongside our Air Force. The British squadrons were based on British territory and were too far away to provide effective support to our troops, continuously retreating to the south. My insistent request to relocate at least part of the British aviation interaction on airfields south of the Loire Churchill categorically rejected. As for ground troops, he promised to send to Normandy 1 Canadian division and leave in France 51th Scottish Division, as well as the remnants of the mechanised brigade, which continued to fight with us. But he could not even approximately say when the Expeditionary Corps, which had recently escaped defeat in Belgium, leaving there, however, all its material, will be able to take part in the battle again. Thus, the joint military actions of London and Paris actually ceased. It was enough one failure on the continent, and Britain entirely engaged in matters of its own defence. This was a victory for the German plan, the inspiration for which, even after his death, remained Schlieffen. This plan, after the German failures in 1914 and 1918, finally led to the disunion of the French and British armed forces, and with it the split of the Franco-English alliance. It was not difficult to foresee what conclusions would be drawn from this supporters of surrender in France. In addition to a conversation with Churchill, on the same day I met with the Minister of War Eden, Minister of the Navy Alexander, Minister of Aviation Sir Archibald Sinclair, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Sir Dill. I also conferred with our ambassador to Great Britain, Corbyn, the chairman of the French-English Coordinating Committee for the Procurement of War Material, with the heads of our missions, military, naval and air. It was evident that while in London the population was not disturbed, on the contrary, people of sophistication feared defeat and doubted the determination of the French government. In the evening an airplane carried me with difficulty back to Paris, to the Bourget airfield, which had been bombed shortly before. On the night of June 9/10, Paul Reynaud called me to his home. He had just received alarming news. The enemy came to the scene below Paris. At the same time, according to all the data, from hour to hour should have expected the transition of German armoured forces in a decisive offensive in Champagne. Thus, the capital was threatened with immediate danger from the west, from the east and from the north. Finally, Francois Poncet reported from Rome that a declaration of war by the Italian government could be expected at any moment. In the face of such unfavourable news, I could offer only one thing: to go to the extreme effort to move immediately to Africa and join the coalition war, with all its consequences. In the few hours I spent in the Rue Saint-Dominique during that 24 hours, I had more than enough reason to be convinced once more that there was no other way out. Events were moving so rapidly that it was difficult to keep up with them. A decision that had just been made was immediately outdated. Attempts to use the experience of the First World War of 1914-1918 did not yield any results. It was believed that there was still a front, a capable command, a people ready to sacrifice. However, all this was only a dream and a memory. In reality, the shocked nation was in a daze. The army believed in nothing and hoped for nothing, and the state machine was spinning in an atmosphere of complete chaos. I felt this particularly well during the brief visits, which, in accordance with the accepted etiquette, I paid to the prominent figures of the Republic, first to President Lebrun, to whom I was introduced at the same time as the new ministers, then to the presidents of the chambers, and finally to the members of the government. Outwardly, they held themselves calmly and with dignity. But it was clear that among this traditional decorum they were no more than extras. In the whirlwind of events, all these cabinet meetings, instructions sent down, reports received at the top, public statements, the stream of officers, officials, diplomats, parliamentarians, journalists who asked about something or reported about, all this gave the impression of some senseless, unnecessary phantasmagoria. Under the given conditions and within the given territorial limits, the only way out was surrender. Either one had to accept it, which many were already inclined to do, or one had to change the framework and conditions of the struggle. A new Marne was possible, but only in the Mediterranean. On June 10 came the death agony. The government was to leave Paris in the evening. The retreat on the front was accelerating. Italy had declared war on us. Now the inevitability of catastrophe was no longer in doubt. However, the leaders of the state, all this tragedy seemed like a heavy dream. At times it seemed that the fall of France from the height of historical greatness in the deepest abyss accompanied by some demonic laughter. In the morning, for instance, the Italian ambassador Gariglia appeared in the Rue Saint-Dominique on a rather strange visit. He was received by Bauduin, who put the Italian diplomat's words, "You will see that the declaration of war will eventually clear up the relations between our two countries. It creates a situation which will ultimately be of great benefit." A short time later, I stopped by Paul Reynaud's house and found Bullitt at his place. I thought that the United States ambassador had appeared to inform the President of the Council of Ministers of the assistance Washington intended to give in the future. Not at all. He came on a farewell visit. The American ambassador remained in Paris in order to take steps in the interest of the French capital if occasion arose. But however laudable were the motives which guided Bullitt, nevertheless the American ambassador to the French government was absent during the most trying days. The arrival of Biddle, who was liaison with the emigrant governments, for all the admirable qualities of that diplomatist, could not alter the conviction of our leaders that France was no longer highly regarded in the United States. Meanwhile, Paul Reynaud was hastily preparing the statement he was going to make on the radio. Just as he was consulting with me on this matter, General Weygand arrived in the Rue Saint-Dominique. As soon as his arrival was announced, he was already in the Prime Minister's office, noticing some surprise on Paul Reynaud's part. The Commander-in-Chief referred to the fact that he had come ostensibly on summons. "I did not summon you," Paul Reynaud remarked. "Neither did I. I added for my part." "In that case there has been a misunderstanding," said General Weygand. "But the mistake is not to be regretted, for I have an important message." He sat down and immediately proceeded to give his view of the situation. His conclusion was obvious. We must immediately ask for an armistice. "The situation is such," he said, placing some paper on the table, "that everyone's responsibility must be precisely defined. I have therefore set forth my opinion in a note which I am handing to you." Although the chairman of the Council of Ministers was in a great hurry, for the time was approaching for his speech, which had already been announced, he still tried to challenge the opinion of the Commander-in-Chief, but the latter stubbornly insisted on his point. The battle in the metropolis was lost. It was necessary to capitulate. "But there are other possibilities," I remarked as the conversation progressed. Weygand asked ironically, "Do you have anything to propose?" "The government doesn't propose, it orders." "And I hope it orders," I replied. The matter ended with Paul Reynaud bidding farewell to the Commander-in-Chief, who left the cabinet in a very grave atmosphere. The last hours of the government's stay in Paris were occupied with the arrangements necessary for such a mass evacuation. In fact, much had already been prepared in accordance with the retreat plan drawn up by the General Secretariat for National Defense. However, it was impossible to foresee everything. In addition, the inexorable movement of the Germans toward Paris posed very difficult problems. From the moment of my appointment as Deputy Minister of National Defense, I had advocated the need to defend the capital, and therefore asked the President of the Council of Ministers, who was at the same time Minister of Defense and Minister of War, to appoint a decisive man to head the garrison of the city. I proposed General de la Treille, who had distinguished himself and his division in the battles of Rethel. But soon the Commander-in-Chief declared Paris an open city, and the Council of Ministers approved this decision. It was urgent to organize the evacuation of the mass of people and a large amount of various property. This is what I was engaged in until the evening. Things were being packed, boxes were being pinned up, Visitors who had arrived at the last moment were bustling about, and telephones were ringing hopelessly. Around midnight, we got into the car with Paul Reynaud. We drove slowly, as the road was jammed. At dawn, we arrived at Orleans, at the city prefecture, from where a telephone connection was established with the Stavka, located in Briard. General Weygand soon telephoned, asking to speak to the Prime Minister. The latter picked up the phone and was extremely surprised to learn that in the afternoon should arrive Churchill. It turned out that the Commander-in-Chief, through military communication, had asked him to come urgently to Briar. It is necessary, added General Weygand, that Churchill should personally familiarise himself with the actual situation at the front. How? I appealed to the head of the government. Do you permit the Commander-in-Chief to summon the English Prime Minister on his own initiative? Do you not see that General Weygand is busy not at all with the implementation of the operational plan, but with the implementation of a policy that is at variance with the policy of your government? Do you really intend to keep him in his former post? You are right, Paul Reynaud replied. It is time to put an end to this situation. You and I have already spoken of General Huntsiger as a possible successor to Weygand. Let us go to Huntsiger at once. But when the cars were brought in, the Prime Minister said to me, perhaps it would be better if you went to Huntsiger alone. I, on the other hand, will make preparations for negotiations with Churchill and the British. We will meet in Briard. The commander of the Central Front, General Huntsiger, I found at his command post in Arcy-sur-Aube. It was at the very moment when Gurien's armoured corps attacked and broke through the front of his armies in Champagne. I was amazed by Huntsiger's coolness. He informed me of the plight of his troops. I informed him of the state of affairs in general. I concluded by saying, the government is clear that the battle in France is actually lost, but it intends to continue the war and therefore wants to move to Africa with all the means that can be moved there. Such a decision implies a complete change in our entire strategy and a radical reorganization. The current Commander-in-Chief is not the man to do that. Maybe you can do it. I will, simply answered Huntsiger. Excellent. You will receive appropriate instructions from the government. I travelled to Briar via Romigi and Seine to meet with the commanders of the various formations. There were signs of disorder and panic everywhere. Everywhere troop units mixed with refugees were moving southward. The road was so congested that my humble car had to stand for an hour near Mary. The unusual fog, which many people mistook for a gas cloud, added to the alarming condition of the disorderly crowd of military men, which resembled a running herd. Arriving at the headquarters, I immediately went to Paul Reynaud and handed over the answer Huntsiger. However, it was immediately clear to me that the immediate removal of Weygand is no longer in the Prime Minister's intentions, and that he again decided to continue the war with the Commander-in-Chief, who seeks an armistice. Walking through the gallery, I met Marshal Pétain, whom I had not seen since 1938. You're already a general, he addressed me. I can't congratulate you on that. What's the use of rank in defeat? But you too, Mr. Marshal, were promoted to general during the retreat of 1914, and a few days later we won the victory at the Marne. I see nothing in common, Pétain muttered in reply. In this he was right. Soon the English Prime Minister arrived and the meeting began. At this meeting the views and sentiments which were to characterize the new phase of the war clashed openly. All the principles on which action and intercourse had hitherto been based had become a thing of the past. Anglo-French solidarity, the power of the French army, the authority of the government, confidence in the command could no longer serve as starting points. Each of the participants in the meeting henceforth acted not as a partner in a game played in concert, but as a man oriented only to himself and playing the game in his own personal interests. As for General Weygand, he was anxious to end the battle and end the war as soon as possible. Relying on information from Generals Georges and Besson, he painted before the meeting a picture of an utterly hopeless military situation. The Commander-in-Chief, who incidentally, from 1930 to 1935 was Chief of the General Staff, presented the reasons for the defeat of his armies calmly, albeit somewhat aggressively, blaming others for it and glossing over his own responsibility. His conclusion was that the senseless trial must be stopped, for the whole military system might suddenly collapse, thus opening a wide space for anarchy and revolution. Marshal Pétain spoke in favour of the pessimistic view. Wanting to diffuse the atmosphere, Churchill addressed him in a somewhat joking tone. Well, Mr. Marshal, remember the Battle of Amiens in March 1918? how bad things were then. At that time I visited you in your headquarters. You told me your plan, and a few days later the front was restored. Pétain sternly replied, "You're right. The front was restored. Then the breakthrough was on the English section of the front. However, I sent 40 divisions to bail you out of trouble. Today we are the ones who are defeated. Where are your 40 divisions?" The head of the French government repeatedly repeated that France will not stop fighting, and persuaded the British to send us to the aid of the main forces of their air force. And despite all this, it was clear that he did not intend to part with Pétain and Weygand, as if still hoping one day to make them supporters of his policy. Churchill seemed unshaken and full of energy. In relation to the French in a critical position, he behaved cautiously, taking a position of sympathetic waiting. It seemed to me that he was already in the grip of a fearful but tempting prospect, imagining, and perhaps not without secret satisfaction, an England alone on her island, and himself who, at the cost of heroic efforts, was becoming her saviour. As for me, looking ahead, I was well aware that all this verbiage was useless and futile, since it did not consider the only acceptable solution: the organisation of forces in the Empire. After 3 hours of discussion, which yielded no results, at the same table sat down to lunch. I found myself sitting next to Churchill. Our conversation strengthened my conviction that this is a man of unyielding will. Churchill, in turn, undoubtedly realised that disarmed de Gaulle did not become less determined. Admiral Darlan, who was absent from the meeting, appeared in the afternoon. Passing ahead of himself Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Villemain, he approached Paul Reynaud. What Darlan reported was thought-provoking. The fact was that against Genoa was prepared a combined operation involving the Navy and bomber aviation. According to the plan, the action was to begin at night. But Darlan had already changed his mind and wanted to cancel the order, putting as an argument hesitation of General Villemain, who feared that the Italians would retaliate and destroy fuel depots at Bure. Nevertheless, he asked for the consent of the government to rescind the order. "What is your opinion?" Paul Reynaud addressed me. "In our present position," I replied, "the most prudent thing would be, on the contrary, to spare nothing. It is necessary to carry out the intended operation." Darlan, however, prevailed, and the order for the operation was cancelled. And yet, in spite of this, 3 days late against the intended date, Genoa was shelled by a small detachment of ships. This incident convinced me that Darlan, too, was now drawing his own line. The day of June 12, I spent at the chateau of Bévais, belonging to Mr. Le Provost Delaunay, and, with General Colson, worked out a plan of evacuation to North Africa. I must confess that, finding myself in solitude and reflecting on the events I had witnessed the day before, I had every reason to fear that the mood of defeatism had gone too far, and that the plan I was formulating would never be realized. Nevertheless, I was determined to do everything in my power to get the government to undertake its realization and to oblige the command. Having finished the bulk of my work, I made my way to Chisset, the residence of Paul Reynaud. It was already late. At the close of the meeting of the Council of Ministers at Cannes, to which I had not been invited, the Prime Minister returned about 11 o'clock at night, accompanied by Baudouin. While they and their entourage sat down to dinner, I, taking a seat at the table, put the question concerning North Africa with all certainty. But my interlocutors were inclined to speak only of the question which the Council of Ministers was discussing. This question connected, however, with the problem I had raised, and very urgent, concerned the seat of government for the immediate future. Indeed, having forced the sign, the Germans could soon reach the lawyer, either Bordeaux or Kemper. Immediately an argument broke out at the table, disorderly and noisy, because everyone was tired and in a nervous state. No definite decision was made. Paul Reynaud left, making an appointment with me for the morning. I stood in for Kemper, of course. It was not at all that I flattered myself with any hopes of being able to hold out in Brittany. But if the government moved there, sooner or later it would have no alternative but evacuation by sea. Since the Germans, in order to act against England, would inevitably have to occupy Brittany, this peninsula could in no way become a free zone. Once at sea, the ministers would in all probability have had to head for Africa, either by direct route or by making a preliminary stopover in England. In either case, Kemper would have been a stage on the road to vigorous action. That is why, when Paul Reynaud, immediately after I entered the government, spoke to me about the Breton Bastion project, I joined the project. On the contrary, men like Pétain, Weygand, Baudouin who were leading the surrender and, contrary to their assertions, were guided by their political considerations and not at all by military motives, objected to such an option. Early on the morning of June 13, I returned to Chissy. After much debate and in spite of my arguments, the Prime Minister decided to transfer the government to Bordeaux, on the ground that this was the opinion expressed by the ministers the previous day. I then became even more insistent that at least an order should be issued obliging the Commander-in-Chief to prepare for the transfer of troops to Africa. I knew that this was exactly what Paul Reynaud intended to do as a last resort, but the atmosphere of various influences and intrigues which surrounded him was exerting such an influence on him that this one hope was disappearing literally before his eyes. On the same day, however, about 12 o'clock, the Prime Minister signed a letter addressed to General Weygand, stating that the government expected him first of all to organise the most stubborn defence in the Massif Central and in Brittany, and then in the event of our defeat, to move outside the metropolis to organise the struggle there, making use of the freedom of the seas. This letter undoubtedly indicated an intention to take rescue measures, but it did not seem to me to have been drafted in the categorical tone dictated by circumstances. Moreover, after the letter had been signed, it was discussed behind the scenes for some time and was not sent until the next day. On the morning of the same day, June 13, the President of the Senate, Geneni, and the President of the House, Heriot, arrived in Chissy. The first did not lose his presence of mind in the midst of general confusion and reminded him of Clemenceau, whose direct and close collaborator he had been during the difficult days of 1917-1918. The second, affable and vocal, spoke passionately of the varied feelings with which he was seized. Both were supporters of the Prime Minister, opponents of surrender, and ready to move with the government to Algeria. I was once more convinced that, in spite of all the intrigues of the surrenderists who surrounded Paul Reynaud, it could prevail if only he yielded to them in nothing. I was already in Beauvais, when, in the afternoon, I received a telephone call from de Margerie, Paul Reynaud's chief of diplomatic staff. This is what he informed me. In a little while a meeting will begin at Tours, in the prefecture building between the President of the Council of Ministers and Churchill, who has just arrived with several of his cabinet ministers. I was warned of this, too, at the last moment. Although you have not received an invitation, I want you to attend. Baudouin is acting actively, and I dislike it very much. I left for Tours, alarmed at so unexpected a meeting, which the Prime Minister had seen fit to keep silent about, though I had spent several hours with him. In the courtyard and on the sidelines of the prefecture were crowded a multitude of deputies, officials and journalists who had come for news. The noisy crowd resembled the chorus of an ancient tragedy approaching its denouement. I entered the office where Paul Reynaud, Baudouin and Margerie were. There was a break in the meeting, but just at that moment Churchill and his colleagues entered the office. Margerie had time to tell me that the British ministers were meeting in the park, preparing an answer to the following question posed by the French. Does England agree that, contrary to the agreement of March 28, 1940, prohibiting the separatist conclusion of an armistice, France asked the enemy on what terms he is willing to stop hostilities? Churchill sank into a chair. Lord Halifax, Lord Beaverbrook, Sir Alexander Cadogan, and General Spears, who had accompanied them, took their seats. There was a moment of long silence. At last the English Prime Minister spoke in French, monotonously and sadly, holding a cigar in his teeth and shaking his head gently. He began by expressing his personal sympathy, the sympathy of his government and his people, for the fate that had befallen France. We are quite aware, he said, of the position in which France finds herself. It is clear to us that you see no way out of the impasse. Our friendly feelings toward you remain unchanged. You may rest assured that in any case England will not give up the struggle. Whatever the conditions and wherever we have to fight, we will fight to the end, even if you leave us alone. Referring to the prospect of an armistice between the French and Germans, which I thought would enrage him, Churchill, on the contrary, expressed a sympathetic understanding on the subject. But when he turned to the naval question, he was suddenly exceptionally exacting and anxious for complete clarity. There is no doubt that the British government feared to such an extent the transfer of the French fleet into the hands of the Germans that it was inclined, before it was too late, to release us from the terms of the agreement of March 28th, if only to obtain assurances as to the fate of our ships. In fact, that was the conclusion to be drawn from that dreadful meeting. Before leaving the room, Churchill, moreover, insisted that France, in the event of a cessation of hostilities, France preliminarily transferred to England all 400 prisoners of war German pilots. This was immediately promised to him. Accompanied by Paul Reynaud, the English moved into the next room, where the presidents of both houses, as well as many ministers, were present. Here a very different atmosphere prevailed. Jeanneret, Heriot, Louis Marie in particular were talking about only one thing: the necessity of continuing the war. I approached Paul Reynaud and asked in a somewhat agitated tone, "Would you really consent to France requesting an armistice?" "Certainly not," he replied. "But it is necessary to influence the English to obtain more extensive assistance from them." To take this answer seriously, of course, I could. After a noisy farewell in the courtyard of the prefecture, everyone dispersed, and I, completely depressed, returned to Beauvais. In the meantime, the President of the Council of Ministers had sent a telegram to President Roosevelt. He begged him to help us, making it clear that otherwise it would be all over for us. In the evening, Paul Reynaud said on the radio, "If a miracle must be performed to save France, I believe in that miracle." I had no doubt that things were already coming to a head. If the commandant of a besieged fortress talks about its surrender, it is already safe to say that the days of the fortress are numbered. Similarly, France was heading for surrender, because the head of the French government officially recognized that such a possibility is not excluded. A further stay in the cabinet, for all the modesty of my position, was becoming impossible for me. However, at night, just as I was about to send a letter of resignation, Georges Mandel, alerted by my chief of staff, Jean Laurent, summoned me to his office. I was ushered into the office of the Minister of the Interior by André Diethelm. Mandel spoke to me with a seriousness and determination that impressed me. Like me, he was convinced that the independence and honour of France could only be defended by continuing the war. It was from this national interest that he advised me not to leave my post. "Who knows," he said, "perhaps after all we may succeed in getting the government to move to Algiers." He told me what had happened after the departure of the British in the Council of Ministers, where a spirit of determination had prevailed, though Weygand had made a whole scene there. I learned from Mandel that just as we were talking, the first German units were entering Paris. Adding of the future, Mandel added, "At any rate, the World War is just beginning. You, General, still have great tasks to accomplish. And among all of us you have the advantage of a man with an impeccable reputation. Strive only to act in the interests of France. And remember that, if the occasion arises, your present position can facilitate you much. I must say that this argument persuaded me to delay my resignation. In all probability, it was this that made practically possible what I was able to do subsequently." On June 14, the government moved to Bordeaux. I bid farewell to my hosts, Le Provost Delaunay. Together with all the family members who had not been mobilized, they had decided not to leave their home, where they remained during the retreat of our troops and then during the occupation. After a harrowing journey along a road filled with refugees, I arrived by evening in Bordeaux, at the headquarters of the military district where Paul Reynaud was to have his residence. There I found Marquet, the mayor of the city, and a deputy. I was the first to be informed by him of the contents of the discouraging statement which he was about to make to the Prime Minister. When Paul Reynaud appeared, I said to him, "For 3 days I have been convinced of the incredible speed with which we are rolling towards surrender. To the best of my ability I have tried to help you, but I have acted in the interests of the continuation of the war. I refuse to accept an armistice. If you remain here, you will be overwhelmed by a wave of defeat. You must evacuate to Algiers as soon as possible. Are you ready for that or not?" "Yes," replied Paul Reynaud. "In that case, I must personally go to London at once to make arrangements with the English for the assistance they will give us in transportation. I shall go there tomorrow. Where shall I find you on my return?" "In Algiers," replied the President of the Council of Ministers. We agreed that I would leave at night, and on the way visit Brittany to see what could be brought out of there by sea. Paul Reynaud asked me to summon Darlan to see him the next morning. He said he wanted to speak to him concerning the fleet. Darlan was at this time on his way to La Garitude. In the evening I managed to contact him and arrange a meeting. He replied irritably, "Arrive in Bordeaux tomorrow. I can't understand what the Prime Minister is doing there. As for me, I am in command and cannot waste time." In the end he did obey after all. However, the tone in which Darlan spoke did not bode well. A few minutes later, during a short conversation with the Minister without portfolio, Jean Ebenegger, who had hitherto been an advocate of fighting to the end. I had an opportunity to see how much the mindset of some of the figures had changed. Ibarnagre appeared to me at the Hotel Splendid, where I was hastily dining with Geoffroy de Courcelles. For me, an old soldier, who obey my superiors Pétain and Weygand. Perhaps the day will come when you will be convinced that for a minister the concern for the salvation of the country must prevail over all other feelings, I replied. Pétain, who was dining in the same room, I greeted in silence. Without saying a word, he shook hands with me. From that time I never saw him again. What force drew him toward such a fatal destiny? The whole life of this extraordinary man was one of self-denial. Too proud to engage in intrigue, too significant to put up with a secondary role, too self-loving to serve, in his soul he was obsessed with a thirst for power, which in him fueled the consciousness of his own superiority, obstacles in his way, and arrogant contempt for others. There was a time when military glory lavished its insidious gifts upon him, but it did not bring him satisfaction, for he was not its only pumper. And now suddenly, already in his declining years, events gave his talents and his ambition the coveted opportunity to unfold to its full extent. However, he could only achieve his elevation at the cost of the fall of France, crowning it with the shame of his glory. It must be said that in general, Marshal Pétain considered the war lost. This old soldier, who put on a military uniform soon after the end of the War of 1870–1871, was inclined to consider the current war as another Franco-German conflict. Having been defeated in the first battle with the Germans, we defeated them in the second, that is, in the War of 1914–1918. We were helped, of course, by the Allies, but they played a minor role. Now we are defeated in the third war. It is very hard, but quite natural. After Sedan and the fall of Paris, in the opinion of Pétain, should have ended the war to conclude an armistice and, if necessary, to deal with the Commune, as in his time in similar circumstances, dealt with her thiers. For the old Marshal, such factors as the global nature of the war, the possibility of using overseas territories, the ideological consequences of Hitler's victory did not matter. Such moments he was not in the habit of taking into account. And yet I am convinced that at another time Marshal Pétain would not have agreed to assume the role of head of state in the face of French defeat. I am sure that, remaining himself, he would have resumed a struggle as soon as he was convinced that he had been mistaken, that victory was possible, that France was capable of contributing to it. But alas, the years had worn him down. On the slope of years, he was already easily influenced by people who, cleverly taking advantage of the fatigue of the Marshal, covered their machinations with his loud name. Old age is a wreck, and since we were destined to drink the cup to the bottom, the old age of Marshal Pétain had to symbolize the collapse of France. That's what I thought of that night on the road to Brittany. At the same time, I was determined to continue the war at all costs. Arriving in Rennes on the morning of June 15, I met there with General René Altmaier, who commanded the various formations fighting west of the Mayenne River, with the commander of the military district, General Guitry, prefect of the Department of Ille-et-Vilaine. All three displayed the utmost conscientiousness, each in his own section. I endeavoured to harmonize their efforts and their capabilities in the interest of the defence of the area. I then reached Brest, overtaking on the way the British echelons which were moving toward Brest, whence they were to be evacuated by sea. At the Maritime Prefecture, together with Admiral Trobe and the commander of the Western Naval Area, de Laborde, I studied what facilities the Navy had and what it needed for the loading of troops in the ports of Brittany. In the afternoon I was already on board the destroyer Milan, which was to take me to Plymouth. There was also a group of chemists headed by General Lemoyne, sent by the Minister of Armaments Raoul Dautry of England in order to bring to a safe place heavy water. As we left the Brest raid, I was saluted by the battleship Richelieu, already ready to take a course for Dakar. From Plymouth I left for London, where I arrived at dawn on June 16. In a few minutes, in the room of the Hotel Hyde Park, where I, from the road to bring myself in order, appeared Corbin and Monnet. The ambassador informed me that meetings with the various English figures with whom I was to negotiate on the question of troop transportation had already been arranged for the morning. It was also agreed that if France did not ask Germany for an armistice, Paul Reynaud and Churchill would meet the next day in the morning at Concarneau to give joint instructions for the loading of troops on ships. My interlocutors then turned to another matter. "We know," they said, "that defeatist sentiment is growing very rapidly in Bordeaux. While you were on your way, The French government confirmed by telegram the request which Paul Reynaud made orally to Churchill on June 13, that France should be released from the obligations imposed on her by the agreement of March 28. What will be the English reply, which is expected this morning, we do not yet know. We think, however, that they will not object, provided that assurances are given concerning the French Navy. Thus, the last minutes are coming, especially as there is to be a meeting of the Council of Ministers at Bordeaux in the afternoon, and this meeting is likely to be decisive. It seemed to us, continued Corbyn and Monnet, that only some unexpected event, drastically changing the situation, would be capable of changing the general mood and, at any rate, of strengthening Paul Reynaud's intention of going to Algiers. That is why, together with Sir Robert Vansittart, Permanent Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of Great Britain, we have prepared a project which seems likely to produce the proper effect. It concerns the amalgamation of France and England, with a proposal which the English government should solemnly address to the government of Bordeaux. According to this project, the two states resolve to form a single government, to share their capacities, to make equal sacrifices, in short, to link their destinies completely. It is not improbable that such a proposal, made in the present atmosphere, will incline our ministers to attempt to strengthen resistance, or will at least induce them to delay surrender. It is still necessary, however, that our project should receive the approval of the English government. Only you can get this from Churchill. It is already agreed that soon you will meet him at breakfast. Thus, there is an excellent opportunity to talk to him on this subject if, of course, you yourself approve of such an idea. I was familiarized with the draft statement. At once I thought that the very enormity of the plan excluded the possibility of its immediate realization. It was a striking fact that even if the merger of England and France were to be recognized, it would be impossible, even in principle, to unite the two countries with their institutions, interests and possessions into one whole by a mere exchange of notes. Even those points in the draft which could be practically settled, such as the question of a joint military effort, would require long negotiations. But this proposal from the English government to the French government would have been an expression of solidarity and could in itself have had a very real meaning. Most importantly, I, like Corbyn and Monnet, believed that in the critical situation in which Paul Reynaud was, this project could be a moral support for him and an argument against his cabinet ministers who insisted on ending the struggle. That is why I agreed to persuade Churchill to support this project. The morning was very busy with all sorts of things. First of all, I settled the question regarding the further passage of the transport ship Pasteur, which was carrying from the United States 1,075mm guns, several thousand machine guns and ammunition. In connection with the report of our military mission, I ordered to change the route of this ship, which was already on its way, and to deliver the cargo not to Bordeaux, as was supposed, but to one of the ports of Great Britain. In view of the situation, it was by no means possible to allow this most valuable cargo to fall into enemy hands, and indeed the guns and machine guns delivered by Pasteur allowed to rearm the British troops, which lost at Dunkirk almost all their weapons. As for the transfer of our troops, the British met a sincere willingness to help us ships and ensure the safety of maritime transportation, and all the preparations for this operation was to be carried out by the British Ministry of Navy in conjunction with our naval mission, which was headed by Admiral O'Dundle. But it was quite obvious that no one in London no longer believed in the ability of official France to perk. Meetings with various figures convinced me that in all their plans our allies proceed from the inevitable refusal of France to continue the struggle in the very near future. All were particularly concerned about the fate of our fleet. The thought of it literally did not go out of anyone's head. When meeting with the British in these tense hours, every Frenchman felt a questioning look or heard a direct question. What will happen to your fleet? The English Prime Minister was thinking the same thing when I, with Corbyn and Monnet, breakfasted with him at the Carlton Club. Whatever happens, I addressed him, the French Navy will not be voluntarily surrendered. Pétain himself will not agree to it. Besides, the fleet is Darlan's possession, and a feudal lord does not cede his possessions to anyone. However, the guarantee that the French Navy will never fall into the hands of the Germans could give only one condition: the continuation of the war by us. In this connection, I must confess that the position you took at the meeting at Tours struck me unpleasantly. I got the impression that you do not value our alliance at all. Your concession plays into the hands of those of our people who are inclined to capitulate. You see, we are forced to it, they say. The English themselves have no objection to it. No, that is not at all how you should act to support us at the moment of the greatest crisis. It seemed to me that Churchill hesitated. He was conferring with his Chief of Staff, Major Morton. I thought that at the last moment he wanted to take measures to change his previous decision, and perhaps it was for this reason that, half an hour later in Bordeaux, the English ambassador appeared before Paul Reynaud and took back the note previously handed to him, in which the English government agreed in principle that France should ask the Germans on what terms they were prepared to conclude an armistice. I then touched upon the project of uniting both our nations. Lord Halifax has already spoken to me about it, said Churchill, but it is a matter of extreme difficulty. True, I replied. The realization of such a plan would therefore require a great deal of time, but it is possible to make a statement on the subject immediately. As things stand, you must not neglect anything that might support France and contribute to the preservation of our alliance. After a short discussion, the Prime Minister agreed with me. He immediately gave orders to convene the English cabinet and went to Downing Street to preside at its meeting, and I went there with him. While the Council of Ministers was in session, I and the French ambassador to England were in a room next to the meeting room. In the meantime, having contacted Paul Reynaud by telephone, I warned him that, by agreement with the English government, I expected to send him a very important message before evening. He replied that he would therefore adjourn the meeting of the Council of Ministers until 5 p.m., he said, but to postpone any longer, he said, I cannot. The English cabinet met for 2 hours. From time to time, one minister or another came out of the meeting room to clarify with us Frenchmen a necessary question. But at last all the ministers, headed by Churchill, came out. We agree, they declared. And indeed, except for details, the text of the statement they had drawn up was no different from the one we had proposed to them. I immediately summoned Paul Reynaud by telephone and dictated the text of the document to him. It is very important, remarked the President of the Council of Ministers, and I shall make immediate use of it at the meeting which will begin any minute now. In a few words I tried, as best I could, to encourage him. Churchill picked up the telephone. Hello, Reynaud. De Gaulle is right. Your proposal could have very important consequences. We must hold on. Then, after listening to the French Prime Minister's reply, he said, So until tomorrow, see you at Concarneau? I said goodbye to Churchill. He provided me with an airplane so that I could immediately return to Bordeaux. We agreed that the airplane would remain at my disposal, since events would probably force me to return to England once more. Churchill himself was to leave by train to then head for Concarneau by destroyer. At 9:30 p.m., I landed at Bordeaux. At the airfield I was met by Colonel Humbert and Albertin, members of my office staff. They informed me that the President of the Council of Ministers had resigned and that President Lebrun had instructed Marshal Pétain to form a government. This portended a clear surrender. I immediately made up my mind to leave tomorrow morning. I went to Paul Reynaud and saw that he was under no illusions as to the consequences of Marshal Pétain coming to power. But at the same time he gave the impression of a man who felt relieved that he had been relieved of so great a responsibility. He seemed to me a man who had lost all hope. Only eyewitnesses can understand what the burden of power was like during that terrible period. During many tense days and sleepless nights, the President of the Council of Ministers felt the weight of responsibility for the fate of France. For the head of government is always alone under the blows of fate. After all, it was Paul Reynaud had to survive all stages of our fall. The German breakthrough at Sedan, the Dunkirk disaster, the evacuation of Paris, the panic in Bordeaux. Yet he only took over the government on the eve of our misfortunes, with absolutely no time to meet them in full force. Long before that he had been advocating a military policy that would have avoided disaster. He met the storm with mental fortitude. Not once in those dramatic days did Paul Reynaud lose his temper. Never once did he become heated, indignant, or complain. A tragic spectacle was this outstanding man, undeservedly crushed by huge events. In fact, the personality of Paul Reynaud was quite suitable for the continuation of the war in the existence of a certain order in the state and on the basis of traditions that have developed in the process of historical development of France. But everything was swept away. The head of the government saw how the state was falling apart, how panic seized the people, how allies renounced and lost the presence of mind of the most prominent leaders. From the day the government left the capital, the state power was in a state of agony, which was expressed in the disorderly flight on the roads, in the disruption of all rear services, in the breakdown of discipline in all areas of life, and in general confusion. Under such conditions, Paul Reynaud's wit, his courage, his authority were wasted. He could no longer cope with the avalanche of events. In order to retake the reins of power, he had to break out of the maelstrom, move to Africa, and start again. Paul Reynaud understood this, but for this it was necessary to take a number of extraordinary measures. To change the main command, to remove Marshal Pétain and a good half of the ministers, to do away with certain influences, to reconcile with the full occupation of France, in this unprecedentedly difficult situation, to go to a number of extraordinary and beyond the usual framework of measures. Paul Reynaud did not dare to assume the responsibility of taking such extraordinary decisions. He tried to achieve his goal by manoeuvring. This explains, for example, the fact that he allowed the possibility of discussing the terms of the enemy if England agreed to it. Of course, he thought that even those who insisted on an armistice would refuse it when they learned the terms, and that there would then be a rallying of all men in favour of continuing the war and saving the fatherland. But the drama was too complex for combinations to be practised here. To wage war without sparing any effort, or to capitulate immediately. There was no third way out. Being unable to firmly support the first decision, he gave way to Pétain, who fully and completely supported the second. It should be noted that at this critical moment, the very state system of the Third Republic constrained the activities of the head of the last government. Undoubtedly, many responsible officials were disgusted by the surrender. But the representatives of the public authorities, bewildered in the face of a catastrophe for which they felt responsible, were utterly inept. At a time when a question on which the present and future of France depended arose, Parliament did not sit. The government proved incapable of unanimous decision. The President of the Republic did not raise his voice even in the Council of Ministers in defence of the supreme interests of the country. Ultimately, the collapse of the state lay at the heart of a national catastrophe. In the brilliance of the thunderbolts, the regime appeared in all its appalling infirmity and had nothing to do with the defence of the honour and independence of France. Late in the afternoon I went to the hotel where the English ambassador, Sir Ronald Campbell, was staying, and informed him of my intention to leave for London. General Spears, who took part in the conversation, stated that he would accompany me. I warned Paul Reynaud. He handed me from secret funds 100,000 francs. I asked de Margerie to send without delay to my wife and children, who were at Karantika, the documents necessary to leave for England. They succeeded in leaving Brest on the last steamer. On June 17, at 9 o'clock in the morning, I left with General Spears and Lieutenant de Courcelles in the English plane in which I had arrived the day before. The departure proceeded without any accident or disturbance. We flew over Rochelle and Rochefort. In these ports ships were burning, set on fire by German airplanes. We passed over Pempont, where my seriously ill mother was stationed. The forest was shrouded in smoke. It was burning exploded ammunition depots. After making a stopover on the island of Jersey, we arrived in London in the afternoon. While I was getting settled in my apartment, and Lieutenant Courcelles, who had called the embassy and missions, was already receiving discreet answers everywhere, I, alone and deprived of everything, felt myself in the position of a man on the shore of the ocean, across which he is trying to swim. To continue the war. Yes, of course, to continue. But to what end and on what scale? Many, even when they approved of such a decision, wanted it to be limited to the support that a handful of Frenchmen were giving to the British Empire unbroken and fighting. I never considered in this respect our desire to continue the struggle. For me it was primarily a question of saving the nation and the state. I believe that the honour, unity and independence of France would be lost forever if, in this world war, she alone capitulated and accepted such an outcome. For in that case, whatever the end of the war, whether the defeated nation is liberated from the invader by foreign armies or remains enslaved, the contempt she would feel for herself and the disgust she would inspire in other nations would long poison her soul and the lives of many generations of Frenchmen. As for the present moment, in the name of what to lead some of her sons into a battle which will not be a battle for France? Why provide additional units for the armed forces of a foreign power? No, in order that the effort should not be wasted, it was necessary to get not only individual Frenchmen, but the whole of France to take part in the war. The return of our armies to the battlefields, the resumption of hostilities on our territories and France's participation in this struggle and the recognition by foreign powers that France had not stopped fighting. In other words, it was necessary to transfer sovereignty, taking it away from the perpetrators of disaster and the supporters of defeatism, to those who favoured the continuation of the war and who would win in the future. My knowledge of the people and the situation left me with no illusions about the obstacles to be overcome. I would have to face a powerful enemy who could only be broken by a long war of attrition, and who, in his desire to crush the French will to fight, would have the support of the new French government. Moral and material difficulties lie ahead. They will inevitably be faced in a long and bitter struggle by those who will fight as outcasts with no means at their disposal. They will have to face a lot of objections, accusations, slanderous allegations, put forward by skeptics and cowardly to justify their passivity. There will be so-called parallel speeches, but in fact hostile to each other and pursuing opposite aims. These speeches will inevitably arouse the French passion for controversy and will be used by the political circles and intelligence agencies of the Allies in their own interests. Those who sought the overthrow of the existing order would attempt to steer the movement of national resistance towards the revolutionary chaos which their dictatorship might engender. Finally, the great powers might try to exploit our weakness to their own advantage, to the detriment of France. As for me personally, intending to overcome all these obstacles was at first nothing. I had no power, not even the smallest, and I had no organization to support me. In France, I had no one to vouch for me, and I had no reputation in the country. Abroad, no credibility and no justification for my activities. But the fact that I had none of these things indicated to me a line of conduct. Only by devoting all my energies to the cause of saving the fatherland could I create credibility for myself. Only by acting as an unwavering defender of nation and state could I attract the French to the struggle, arouse their enthusiasm, and gain the recognition and respect of foreign powers. People who throughout the tragic events were confused by my intransigence did not want to realize that for me, who was striving to overcome innumerable contradictory influences. The slightest concession would have led to the collapse of my plans. In other words, however limited in my means and lonely I was, and perhaps it was because of this that I needed to lead the movement and no longer let the power out of my hands. The first thing that had to be done was to raise again the battle flag of France. I had the opportunity to do this by radio. On the afternoon of June 17, I communicated my intentions to Winston Churchill, finding myself shipwrecked on an English shore. Could I do anything without his support? Churchill supported me without delay and, for a start, put the BBC at my disposal. We agreed that I would use the BBC as soon as the Pétain government requested an answer, and that same evening it became known that it had done so. The next day, at 6 p.m., I read the now famous proclamation in front of the microphone. As the words flew into the microphone, words that could no longer be repudiated, I felt that I was ending one life, the one I had led in the face of a solidly French army. At the age of 49, I entered the unknown as a man to whom fate was pointing an unusual path. In taking my first steps in this unusual field, however, I had to find out whether someone else of greater prestige was about to draw continental France and the Empire into the struggle. Since the armistice was not yet in force, it was conceivable that the Bordeaux government would eventually go ahead with the war after all. However small the hope, it was not to be lost. For this reason, when I arrived in London on the afternoon of June 17, I telegraphed at once to Bordeaux, offering my services for the continuation in the English capital of the negotiations which I had begun the day before, concerning purchases in the United States, German prisoners of war, and transfers to Africa. In reply came a telegram demanding my immediate return. On June 20, I wrote to Weygand, who at the surrender suddenly became Minister of National Defence, which sounded mocking, begging him to lead the resistance movement and assuring him, should he do so, of my complete obedience. But this letter was returned to me by the addressee a few weeks later, with a postscript composed in an unkind tone, to say the least. On June 30, the French embassy notified me of an order to report to the prison of Saint-Michel in Toulouse, to be tried by a military court. At first, the military court sentenced me to 1 month's imprisonment. Then, on appeal by Minister Weygand, who was dissatisfied with the decision, I was sentenced to death. Given not without reason, though. This position of the Bordeaux government, I decided to make contact with the authorities of the French colonies. As early as June 19, I sent a telegram to General Noakes, Commander-in-Chief in North Africa and Resident General in Morocco, offering to come at his disposal if he rejected the armistice. That same evening, speaking on the radio, I urged the Afrique of Clausel, Bougode, Lyautey, Nogazet reject the terms of the enemy. On June 24, I telegraphed Nogues a second time and addressed General Mittelhauser-Rui, Commander-in-Chief of the Levant, General Mittelhauser-Rui, High Commissioner in the Levant, Puyu, and General Caitre, Governor-General of French Indochina. I proposed to these high officials the establishment of a body for the defence of the French Empire and informed them that I could immediately arrange for the establishment of a communication between this body and London. On June 27, having learned of the rather bellicose speech of Penroutoun, the Resident General at Tunis, I began to urge him also to join the Committee of Defence, and renewed my proposals to General Mittelhauser and Puot. On the same day I asked, just in case, to reserve places for me and my officers on a French freighter which was to go to Morocco. In reply, I received only a telegram from Admiral de Carpentier, commander of the naval fleet in the Levant. He informed me that Puot and General Mittelhauser had sent General Nogues a telegram similar to mine. In addition, one of General Catru's sons, who was at that time in London, brought me a telegram from his father, who welcomed his decision to fight and asked for my sympathy and approval. But at the same time, Duff Cooper, a member of the cabinet, and General Gort, sent by the English government to North Africa to offer Nogues the support of the armed forces of England, were not even received by him, and returned to London with nothing. Finally, General Dillon, head of the British liaison group in North Africa, was expelled from Algeria. Nogues's first reaction appears to have been to decide to raise the banner of France again. It is known that in view of the armistice conditions put forward by the Germans, he telegraphed to Bordeaux on June 25, declaring his readiness to continue the war, using an expression which I myself had used in a radio address 6 days before. He spoke of panic in Bordeaux, which prevented the government from objectively assessing the possibilities of resistance in North Africa. He urged Weygand to reconsider his orders, to carry out the terms of the armistice, and declared that if these orders were not rescinded, he could only carry them out with an unbearable sense of shame. It is clear that if Nogues had chosen the path of resistance, the whole of France would have followed him. But it soon became known that he himself, as well as other residents, governors and commanders-in-chief in the colonies, submitted to the demands of Pétain and Weygand and ceased to object to the armistice. Only the Governor-General of French Indochina, General Catru, and the commander of the troops in Somalia, General Le Gentiam, did not change their negative attitude toward the armistice. Both were replaced and their subordinates did little to support them. However, this softness of most of the proconsuls coincided with a general political collapse in the metropolis. The newspapers that came to us from Bordeaux and then from Vichy expressed their agreement with the armistice and reported that the truce was accepted by all parties, factions, prominent public figures, and various organizations. The National Assembly, which met on July 9 and 10, handed over almost without debate all power to Pétain. It is true that 80 of the deputies present at the meeting boldly voted against this self-denial. On the other hand, those parliamentarians who went on the ship Massilia to North Africa demonstrated that the French Empire must not stop fighting. Nevertheless, not a single public figure raised his voice in condemnation of the armistice. Moreover, if the collapse of France had struck the world like a thunderbolt, if the peoples of the whole earth had seen with longing the fading of this great light, if the poem of Charles Morgan and the article of François Riac had brought tears to the eyes of many powers were not slow to accept the fact. Of course, the governments of the countries at war with the Axis countries withdrew their representatives from France. This was either on the initiative of the governments themselves, as was the case with Sir Ronald Campbell or General Vanier, or at the request of the Germans. But in London, on the premises of the French embassy, the consul kept in touch with the metropolis while Dupuis, Consul General of Canada, was under Marshal Pétain, nor did the Union of South Africa recall its representative to the Vichy government. In Vichy, an impressive diplomatic corps was formed around the Pan-Nuncio Valerio Valeri, the Soviet ambassador Bogomolov, and soon joined by the US ambassador Admiral Liga. All this could very much cool the enthusiasm of the French, whose first thoughts were turned to the Cross of Lorraine. Fear, despair, and self-interest, both French and non-French, condemned France to complete loneliness. The feelings of many were loyal to her past. Others sought to capitalize on what was left of France. but there was not a single man of name in the whole world who acted without losing faith in the independence, pride, and greatness of France. Such he must have seemed henceforth enslaved, dishonoured, trampled upon, since all who had weight on earth were reconciled to the accomplished fact. In the midst of this universal apostasy, my mission seemed to me clear and at the same time grave. At this most tragic period of France's history, I was assuming responsibility for her destiny. But France is inconceivable without the sword. First of all, it was necessary to create an army. I set about it without delay. There were some French military units in England. In the first place were the units of the Light Mountain Division, which, after a brilliant campaign in Norway under General Bithard, had been transferred to Brittany in the middle of June, and then transported to England with the last English units. Then naval ships of about 100,000 tons total displacement, which left Cherbourg, Brest, and Lognan. On their board, in addition to the crew, were many sailors from other ships and sailors of the auxiliary fleet, a total of about 10,000 people. In addition, in hospitals in England were on the treatment of several thousand soldiers wounded recently in Belgium. French military missions assumed command and administrative functions in order to keep all these forces subordinate to Vichy and to prepare their general repatriation. Even the mere establishment of contact with these numerous and dispersed groups presented me with considerable difficulties. At first I had at my disposal only a small number of officers, almost exclusively junior officers, who were well-meaning but powerless to fight their superiors. Propaganda among the non-commissioned officers and soldiers they managed to meet was all they could do. The results were not brilliant. 8 days after my proclamation of June 18, the number of volunteers stationed in Olympia Hall, provided for us by the English, amounted to several hundred. It must be said that the English authorities gave no assistance at all to our efforts. It is true that they distributed leaflets informing French soldiers that they could choose between repatriation, joining General de Gaulle, and service in His Majesty's forces. It is true that the instructions given by Churchill to General Spears, whom he had entrusted with the task of mediating between Free France and the British establishments, overcame distrust and inertia in a number of cases. It is true that the press, radio, many organizations, and numerous individuals widely publicized our cause. But the British command, expecting from day-to-day German offensive and possibly invasion, was too absorbed in its own preparations to engage in a matter, in their view, very secondary. Besides, following a kind of habit, it was more inclined to recognize the legitimate authority, that is, the Vichy government and its missions. Lastly, it was not without distrust of its yesterday's allies. Humiliated in their misfortune, dissatisfied with themselves and others, and attacked on all sides. What would they do if the enemy came? Was it not most prudent to drive them out of England as soon as possible? And what could the few battalions and crews without commanding officers that General de Gaulle was trying to enlist in the Allied cause ultimately do? On June 29 I went to Trentham Park, where our Light Mountain Division was stationed. The division commander wanted to return to France with the firm intention of joining the struggle in due course, which, however, he subsequently did with courage and valour. He made sure that I was able to familiarise myself with every unit. I succeeded in bringing to my side the bulk of both battalions of the 13th Semi-Brigade of the Foreign Legion, with their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Megrin-Vernet, and his assistant, Captain Koenig, 200 mountain riflemen, 2/3 of a tank company, several units of artillery, engineers and communications troops, several officers of the staff and various services, among whom were Major Conchard, Captains de Vavre and Tissier. That's were my successes, although after my departure from the camp the British Colonels Chair and Willem, sent by the War Ministry, in turn assembled the units to declare to them literally as follows: "You are perfectly free in your choice, if you wish to serve under the command of General de Gaulle. But we must warn you, speaking frankly to you, that if you choose to do so, you will become rebels against your government." The next day I decided to visit the camps at Aintree and Haydock, where there were several thousand French sailors. As soon as I arrived, the English admiral in command of the Liverpool naval base told me that he was against my meeting with the sailors, as it might disturb order. I was forced to leave with nothing. A few days later I had good luck at Harrow Park. In spite of everything, a movement of volunteers had sprung up among the French sailors. Several determined officers who immediately joined me, such as Captains 3rd Rank D'Argentlew, Witzel, Molek, and Jordan, took a very active part in this movement. The officers and sailors of 3 small warships immediately came over to my side. They included the submarine Ryubai, the submarine Ryubai, which was cruising along the Norwegian coast, the submarine Narwhal, which left Sfax immediately after my proclamation and returned to Malta, and a trawler converted into a patrol ship, the Presidan Ondis. The arrival of Vice Admiral Muslier, who was disliked by many in the Navy for his character and certain facts of his career, but whose knowledge and experience were of value in this turbulent period, enabled me to place at the head of our fledgling naval forces a knowledgeable and responsible commander. At the same time, several dozen airmen, whom I visited at the camp at Saint-Atom, had rallied around Captains de Rancourt, Astier de Viat, and Bicourt Foth, and were waiting for Major Pidgeot to take command. In the meantime, individual volunteers were arriving daily in England. As a rule, they came from France in ships leaving regularly for England, or escaped in boats which they managed to procure, or made their way with great difficulty through Spain, eluding the Spanish police who sent those detained by them to Camp Miranda. The pilots who took possession of the airplanes managed to escape from North Africa and landed in Gibraltar, despite the efforts of the Vichy government. Merchant seamen who happened to be away from French ports, as well as ships that did not obey the Vichy regime, such as the Capo Olmo, were willing to participate in the fighting. Frenchmen living abroad also offered their services. I gathered in White City 2,000 Frenchmen who had been wounded at Dunkirk and were being treated in English hospitals, and from this number 200 volunteers joined me. Also the colonial battalion at Cyprus, where it had been transferred from the Army of the Levant, came over to my side, together with its commander, Major Larotte. In the last days of June, a whole flotilla of fishing vessels docked at Cornwall, bringing me all the fit men from South Helena. Our determination grew as we were joined day by enthusiastic young men. Many of them had performed feats of heroism to get to us. Telegrams piled up on my desk from every corner of the globe. Individuals and small groups of people sent me stirring requests to volunteer. My officers and those of Spear's group had shown marvels of persistence and ingenuity to arrange their arrival. Suddenly, a sorrowful event halted the flow of volunteers. On July 4, radio and newspapers reported that the previous day the English Mediterranean fleet had attacked a French squadron anchored at Mers el-Kabir. At the same time, we learned that the British had suddenly seized French warships taking refuge in English ports and had forcibly landed and interned, not without bloody incidents, officers and sailors. Finally, on July 10, news was published of the torpedoing by British planes of the battleship Richelieu in the Dakar roadstead. London newspapers and official communiques sought to portray this aggressive action as a victory won at sea. It was clear that the British government and the Maritime Ministry fear for the future, echoes of ancient rivalries at sea, resentments that had accumulated since the beginning of the battle for France, and especially aggravated in connection with the armistice concluded by the Vichy government, resulted in one of those wild impulses, when long-restrained instinct of this nation breaks everything in its path. Meanwhile, it was perfectly clear that the French Navy had never intended hostile action against the English. From the moment of my arrival in London, I had constantly proved this to the English government as well as to the Naval Ministry. It was evident, however, that Darlan, who regards the fleet as his own property irrespective of any consideration of the national interests of the country, would not cede it to the Germans so long as he commanded it. If Darlan and his aides were unwilling to play the wonderful part which events afforded them and become the saviours of France, since, unlike the army, the navy was comparatively intact, it was because they thought it was safe. Lord Lloyd, the English Minister for the Colonies, and Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, who arrived at Bordeaux on June 18, received an assurance from Darlan that our ships would not be handed over to the Germans. Britain and Bordouin, for their part, strongly confirmed this. Finally, contrary to the version spread at first by British and American agencies, the terms of the armistice did not contain any direct German encroachment on the French Navy. Still, it must be recognized that in connection with the surrender of the government of Bordeaux and possible concession on their part in the future, England may have feared that the enemy could subsequently succeed in capturing our fleet. In that case, a mortal danger would have been hanging over England. In spite of the feeling of pain and indignation which I and my comrades felt in connection with the drama at Mers el-Kabir, I believe that the salvation of France was above all things, above even the fate of her navy, and that it was our duty not to cease fighting for a moment. On June 8, I expressed this openly on the radio. The British government, after hearing the report of the Minister of Information, Duff Cooper made a nice gesture by putting the BBC at my disposal, even though parts of my statement were very unpleasant for the British. But our hopes were dealt a terrible blow. The effect of it had an immediate effect on the recruitment of volunteers. Many military and civilians who had intended to join us abandoned their intention. Moreover, the attitude of the authorities in the French Empire towards us, as well as that of the land and naval forces, changed in most cases from hesitation to condemnation. Of course, the Vichy government did not miss an opportunity to make the most of this incident to its advantage. Serious difficulties arose in the question of annexing the territories of Africa to us. Nevertheless, we continued our cause. On July 13, I ventured to announce, Frenchmen, know that you still have an army. On July 14, in Whitehall, in the presence of an excited crowd, I received the parade of our first detachments, and then led them to lay a wreath, laced with a tricolour ribbon, at the foot of the statue of Marshal Foch. On July 21, I succeeded in getting many of our pilots to take part in the bombardment of the Rouen, and I directed that a report be published that the Free French were again taking part in the war effort. At the same period, all our forces, at the suggestion of D'Argent Cliou, adopted the Cross of Lorraine as their emblem. On August 24, our little army received a visit from King George VI. At the sight of this army, one could tell that the splinter of the sword would receive a strong tempering. But my God, how short that sword was! At the end of July, the total strength of our forces did not even reach 7,000 men. It was all we could muster in England itself. Those French units which had not joined us had been repatriated. It was with great difficulty that we obtained the arms and equipment they had left behind in England, for they often passed into the hands of the English or other allies. As for the navy, we were only able to equip a few ships, and it was with pain in our hearts that we saw other ships flying a foreign flag. In spite of all obstacles, however, our first units were gradually formed. They were poorly armed, but were composed of determined men. These men were of that sturdy breed to which the fighters of the French resistance belonged wherever they went. A thirst for risk and adventure, a contempt for the cowardly and indifferent, a tendency to melancholy and quarrel in periods of calm, a strong comradeship in battle, a sense of national pride which was painfully sharpened by the misfortune of their homeland and by contact with well-to-do allies, and above all a firm belief in the success of their own cause. These were the psychological traits of the character of this handful of the best sons of France. Gradually they became more and more numerous, and they carried the whole nation and the whole empire with them. As we endeavoured to build up a small army, it became necessary to settle our relations with the English government. The latter, however, sought to do this, not so much from a love of legal punctuality, as from a desire that in His Majesty's territory the rights and duties of the fighting French, those sympathetic but troublesome men, should be precisely defined. From the outset I made Churchill aware of my intention to set up, if it should prove possible, a national committee to direct our war effort. In order to give us support in this matter, the British government issued 2 statements on June 23. The first stated its refusal to recognise the independent character of the Bordeaux government. The second announced the project of establishing a French National Committee and stated in advance its intention to recognise and cooperate with it in all matters relating to the conduct of the war. On June 25, the British government issued a communique in which it reported that a number of high officials of the French Empire had expressed their desire to join the resistance movement and offered them its support. But then, as no one responded to this appeal, the London cabinet, with General de Gaulle alone before it, decided on June 28 to recognise him officially as head of the Free French. In this capacity, I began the necessary negotiations with the British Prime Minister and with the Foreign Office. The negotiations began with a memorandum which I sent on June 26 to Churchill and Lord Halifax. The negotiations ended on August 7, 1940, with the signing of the agreement. Some articles of the agreement, which I insisted on, caused a rather delicate discussion between the Allied representative Strang and our representative, Professor René Cassin. Considering that it was possible that the vicissitudes of war might force England to make a compromise peace, and considering that the English might, for goodness' sake, be flattered by one or other of our overseas possessions, I insisted that Great Britain guarantee the restoration of the boundaries of the metropolis and the French colonial empire. The British agreed eventually to promise the full restoration of the independence and greatness of France, but made no commitment to our territorial inviolability. Although I was convinced that the direction of general military operations on land, sea and air should naturally be exercised by the English commanders, in view of the balance of forces, I reserved to myself under all circumstances the supreme command of the French forces, recognizing only the general directives of the English command. Thus, the purely national character of these forces was established. Moreover, I insisted on the proviso, not without objection on the part of the English, that in no case would the volunteers turn their arms against France. This did not mean that they were never to fight the French. Alas, just the opposite should have been foreseen, for Vichy was only Vichy, and by no means France. But this proviso was to guarantee that our army, fighting in conjunction with the Allies, would not injure the national patrimony of France as well as her interests. Although the cost of arming the forces of Free France was temporarily borne by the English government, for we had no funds at first, I insisted that it should be stipulated that it was only an advance, which would be reimbursed afterwards, in consideration of supplies on our part. Indeed, this debt was fully repaid in the course of the war, so that in the final analysis the Free French armed forces were by no means dependent on England. Finally, despite the passionate desire to increase the tonnage of the merchant navy, a passion which, quite legitimately, was seized upon by the English, we had no difficulty in obtaining their agreement that constant communication should be established between the English and French forces to settle questions as to the use of French merchant vessels and their crews. This document was signed by myself and Churchill at Chequers. The agreement of August 7 was of no small importance to Free France, not only because it relieved us of material difficulties in the near future, but also because the British authorities, who now had an official basis for dealing with us, did not hesitate to help us. But above all, the whole world learned that, in spite of all obstacles, the foundations of Franco-British cooperation had been laid. This was not slow in affecting the attitude towards us of some territories of the French Empire and of the French living abroad. In addition, other states, seeing that Great Britain recognized Free France, made some steps towards us. This applied in the first place to the governments that had found their refuge in England. Of course, their opportunities were extremely limited, but they retained their international representation and international influence. For every European country that was invaded by Hitler's armies saved its independence and sovereignty in a free land, so did those countries whose territories were subsequently occupied by Germany and Italy. Not one government agreed to wear the yoke of the invader, not one, except only the government which declared itself the government of France, and which had at its disposal a vast empire guarded by large armed forces, and one of the strongest fleets in the world. In June, as one catastrophe followed another, the monarchs and ministers of Norway, Holland, Luxembourg, then the president of the Polish Republic and Polish ministers, and some time later the Belgian cabinet, set foot on British soil. England hospitably received the representatives of these governments in exile with a sense of magnanimity mingled with calculation. However poor they were now, many of them brought gold and the currency of their banks. The Dutch had Indonesia and a substantial navy. The Belgians had Congo, the Poles had a small army, the Norwegians had numerous merchant ships, the Czechs, or rather Beans, had an information network in Central and Eastern Europe and active connections in the United States. Among other things, it was flattering for prestige-conscious England to act as the last bulwark of the crumbling old world. For these exiles, Free France, which had nothing, was special. Most of all, it attracted the attention of the unfortunate Poles and Czechs, who had the greatest cause for concern. We, who remained faithful to the traditions of France, represented hope to them, and their sympathies were entirely on our side, in particular Sikorsky and Benesse. In spite of all their suspicion, arising from the intrigues and resentments that aggravated their misfortune, established a strong and permanent bond with me. Perhaps it was only during this terrible period that I truly understood what France was to the world. While we were striving to bring Free France onto the international stage, I was trying to establish the rudiments of power and administration. It would be ridiculous if I, known to almost no one and completely without means, were to proclaim as government the rudimentary apparatus I was creating. Moreover, even though I was convinced that the Vichy government would go downhill until its final fall, even though I declared the illegitimacy of a government dependent on the enemy, I wanted to preserve the possibility of a change of power during the war, should the occasion ever arise. I was therefore very wary of creating anything even in words, as it might interfere with the revival of the state. I only urged the authorities of the French Empire to unite in its defence. Then, when their refusal became known, I decided at the earliest opportunity to create merely a national committee. It was now necessary that sufficiently influential persons should give me their support. In the early days, some optimists believed that there would be many. Every hour there were reports of the passage through Lisbon or the landing in Liverpool of some prominent political figure, some famous general, some academic. But a denial soon came. In London itself, influential Frenchmen who were here in the service or by chance, with few exceptions, did not join Free France. Many left for France, others remained in England, pledging their allegiance to the Vichy government. As for those who opposed the surrender, some went to England or the United States, others entered the service of the English or American government. Very few prominent men became under my banner. "You are right," said to me, for example, Corbin, the French ambassador. "I, who have devoted the best years of my official career to the cause of the Franco-British alliance, openly announced my decision by resigning the day after your proclamation. But I am an old official. For 40 years I've lived and acted according to the established pattern. To be in opposition is beyond me." "You are wrong." Jean Monnet wrote to me to create an organisation which in France might be thought to have been born under the patronage of England. "I fully share your determination to prevent France from withdrawing from the struggle. But it is not from London that efforts for revival must be made. I must return to France," said René Mia, "in order to link my fate with that of my co-religionists, who are awaiting persecution." "I approve of your action," declared Brie to me. "As for me, wherever I am, whether in the metropolis or in the Empire, I shall assist the revival of France with all my strength. We are going to America, André Moreau S. Henry Bonnet, and de Querillis declared to me. It is there that we can be most useful to you. I have been appointed Consul General to Shanghai, Roland de Margerie informed me, and I am in London not to join you, but in order to go from here to China. There I shall serve the interests of France as you do here." On the contrary, Pierre Cotte, shaken by events, begged me to employ him in any kind of work, even sweeping the stairs. But his views were sufficiently well known to make it possible for him to be used. Quite naturally, this almost universal refusal of the major French figures to join me, whatever the reasons, did not enhance the prestige of my cause, and I was compelled to postpone for a later time the formation of the committee. The fewer prominent people joined me at first, the more difficult it was to attract them later on. Some Frenchmen, however, immediately came over to my side and began to fulfill the duties suddenly thrust upon them with such eagerness and energy that, in spite of many obstacles, our ship put to sea and sailed. Professor Cassin was my invaluable collaborator in the preparation of all kinds of acts and documents which gave rise to the internal and external structure of our organisation. Antoine was in charge of our first civil bodies, which was an extremely thankless task in this period, when one had to deal with everything without sufficient experience and knowledge. Lapie Escara, and then Aken maintained contact with the English Foreign Office and with the European governments in exile. They also established contact with the French living abroad, whom I appealed to. The Plevès Denis managed our meagre finances and prepared the conditions under which the colonies could exist if they joined us. Schumann spoke on the radio on behalf of Free France. Massip monitored the press and supplied it with information concerning us. Benjamin coordinated with our allies on the use of French ships and merchant seamen. In the military field, Muselier, with the help of Damogen Liu, Magrin-Vernet, Koenig, Pidgeot, and Rancourt, formed respectively our first naval, land, and air units. Morin was in charge of armament. Tissier de Vavren, Attier de Bois de Boisbe-Bembele made up my staff. Geoffroy de Courcelles served as chief of staff, adjutant, interpreter, and often a good counsellor. Such were the men of my entourage, whom hostile propaganda portrayed as a collection of traitors, mercenaries, and adventurers. But they, inspired by the greatness of the task before us, rallied closely around me, ready to do anything. General Spears defended our interests before the English institutions, whose aid we then needed. He did this vigorously and skillfully, and I must say that these qualities of his were of great value to us at this difficult period. He did not, however, receive much assistance from the English. This man, being a member of Parliament, an officer, a businessman, a diplomatist, a writer, belonged at the same time to various categories of people, without classing himself in any of them, and inspired distrust in his superiors. But in the fight against routine, he skillfully used his intelligence, his incisive wit, which was feared, and finally his charm, which he was able to show on occasion. In all this he felt for France, which he knew as well as a foreigner can know it, a feeling of excited and exacting love. At a time when so many people regarded my case as a venture causing much trouble, Spears at once realized its character and importance. With great enthusiasm he began to fulfill his mission under Free France and its head, but his desire to serve them only made him more zealous. Recognizing the independence of the movement in relation to others, he could hardly reconcile himself to it when it was manifested in relation to himself. That is why, in spite of all that General Spears did for us at first, he afterward turned his back on our cause and began to fight it. And was it not partly in the exasperation with which he came down upon us that he regretted that he could not take part in our cause, and regretted that he had left us? But Free France had not yet met, at the time of its inception, such adversaries as success breeds. It fought only against adversity, which is the lot of the weak. I worked with my staff at St. Stephen's House on the Thames Embankment, in a room with only a few tables and chairs. Subsequently, the English administration put at our disposal a more comfortable room at Carlton Gardens, where we set up our headquarters. It was there that many disappointments were daily heaped upon us. But it was also there that numerous reassurances of encouragement cheered us up, for we were receiving expressions of sympathy from France, with great ingenuity, often with the consent of the censors. Ordinary people sent us letters and telegrams. An example is the photograph taken on June 14 in the Place du Toil as the Germans were entering the city. This photograph, sent on June 19 with the inscription "De Gaulle," "We have heard you. Now we'll be waiting for you," was a shot of a group of grief-stricken men and women standing near the tomb of the unknown soldier. Among the photograph was a shot of a grave that strangers had decorated with many flowers. It was the grave of my mother, who died on July 16 in Pempone, dedicating her sufferings to God for the salvation of the homeland and the success of her son's mission. We could thus imagine the response that our refusal to reconcile ourselves to defeat had in the thickest part of the nation. At the same time, we knew that people all over France were listening to London radio, and this immeasurably increased our fighting ability. However, the French living abroad also expressed their patriotic feelings to us. Many of them, at my urging, established contact with me and united to help Free France. Alglaive and Garrett in London, Udry and Jacques de Sise in the United States, Sustel in Mexico, Baron de Benoit in Cairo, Godard in Teheran, Guerin in Argentina, Randu in Brazil, Pirro in Chile, Giro Juvi in Constantinople, Victor in Delhi, Levy in Calcutta, Barbet in Tokyo, and others were the first to take the initiative in this respect. I soon became convinced that, in spite of the pressure exerted by the Vichy authorities, in spite of the slanders spread by their propaganda, and in spite of the inertia of large sections of the population, the feelings of the people, all that was left of their pride and hope, were turned toward Free France. Not for a single moment in the trials through which I had to pass did the thought of what this majestic call of the people obliged me to do. In England itself, the Free French enjoyed sympathy and respect. The king first wished to express these sentiments to them. So did all the members of the royal family. The ministers and authorities also never missed an opportunity to show their good feelings. But it is difficult to imagine the generous consideration with which the English people everywhere treated us. Various societies were formed to assist our volunteers. Many people came to them offering to help us with their labour, their time, their money. When I appeared in public places, I was invariably met with the most encouraging expressions of sympathy. When the London newspapers reported that the Vichy government had passed the death sentence on me and confiscated my property, a great deal of jewellery from unknown persons was received at Carlton Gardens. Scores of widows sent their wedding rings so that the gold might be used for General de Gaulle's cause. It must be said that England was then passing through an anxious time. From hour to hour the Germans were expected to attack, and the British in such an environment showed amazing resilience. It was a truly remarkable sight to see every Englishman behaving as if he were convinced that the salvation of his country depended on his personal behaviour. This sense of universal responsibility was particularly exciting because in reality everything depended on. Indeed, if the enemy succeeded in gaining air supremacy, England would be finished. The Navy, bombed from the air, would not have been able to prevent German troop transports from crossing the North Sea. An army of about 10 divisions, which suffered significant losses in the Battle of France and deprived of weapons, would not have been able to prevent the landing of the enemy landing. And then the German army formations would easily occupy the entire territory of Britain, despite pockets of local resistance organised by the internal defence troops. Of course, the king and the government would have left for Canada in advance. Informed people whispered the names of politicians, bishops, writers, businessmen who, in case of invasion, would have endeavoured to arrange with the Germans to administer the country under their auspices. But these were the designs of only a limited circle of men. The English in their mass were preparing for a fight to the death. Not to the life, but to the death. Every man and woman was engaged in defensive measures, with great dedication and discipline. The British endured all the hardships of wartime. The construction of shelters, distribution of weapons, tools and materials, work in factories and fields, labour conscription, wartime duties, the card system. This country lacked only the means to wage war, for it had also long neglected its defence. But it seemed as if the British intended to make up for all that was lacking at the cost of their own self-sacrifice. There was no lack of humour, however. For example, one cartoon in the newspaper depicted a formidable German army reached the shores of Britain, but stopped on the road with their tanks, guns, regiments, generals in front of a wooden barrier. A sign indicated that 1 penny was required to enter behind the barrier, not having received from the Germans all the pennies due. The English guard collecting the toll, a courteous but unyielding old man, refused to raise the barrier in spite of the indignation which had engulfed the monstrous column of invaders. Meanwhile, the British Air Force, which was on alert at the airfields, was ready for action. The people were in a state of almost unbearable suspense, and so many, anxious to be rid of it, openly wished that the enemy would attack. Churchill was the first to express his impatience. "I can still see how one August day at Chequers," he shouted, shaking his fists in the air. "Are they not coming? Are you so anxious," I objected to him, "to have the Germans destroy your towns?" And he answered me that the bombing of Oxford, Coventry, Canterbury would cause such a wave of indignation in the United States that America would go to war. I expressed some doubt on this point, recalling that 2 months ago the collapse of France had not induced America to abandon her neutrality. "That was because France had collapsed," exclaims the Prime Minister. "Sooner or later the Americans will enter the war, but only on the condition that we hang in there. That is why fighter aviation occupies all my thoughts." Then he added, "You see that I was right in not giving you aviation at the end of the Battle of France. If it had been destroyed now, all would have been lost to you as well as to us. But, I remarked in my turn, if your fighters had been put into action, it might have breathed life into our alliance and enabled the French to continue the war in the Mediterranean. The British would then be less threatened, and the Americans would be more determined to enter the war in Europe and Africa." Churchill and I eventually came to the banal, but definitive conclusion from the events that shook the West, that in the final analysis England was an island, France a cape of the continent, and America another part of the world.